What if I told you that the incredibly harsh voice in your head, the one calling you a lazy failure right this very second, is actually trying to save your life?
It sounds completely backwards, but it is entirely true.
Right. I mean, picture this. You are staring at a blank screen, or maybe you are standing in the doorway of that notoriously messy room you have been meaning to clean for like 3 straight weeks.
Oh, we've all been there.
Yeah. And you are actively avoiding the task. You're pacing around the house, organizing your spice rack, doing literally absolutely anything else. And instead of just tackling the actual project, there's this incredibly loud internal voice telling you that you aren't smart enough, you aren't capable enough, and, well, you are probably going to completely mess it up anyway.
And the immediate physical result of that voice is just a massive, crushing wave of shame
Phew.
and anxiety.
Exactly.
Because human beings are biologically wired to hate feeling uncomfortable, right?
Right.
We immediately try to escape it. But we don't actually fix the root problem. We just morph that profound discomfort into pure avoidance behaviors.
Which is when you find yourself procrastinating or doom scrolling on social media for 2 hours.
Yeah, or suddenly eating a whole bag of chips.
Yeah.
You are basically trying to numb the discomfort that your own brain just generated.
It is a brutal, exhausting cycle.
Yeah.
And breaking the chains of that negativity is exactly what we are getting into today on this deep dive.
Yes.
We are getting into episode 3 of The Art of Letting Go by Nick Trenton. And our mission here isn't just to talk about some abstract psychological theories, let's be real. It is to understand how you can actually short-circuit this avoidance cycle, how to redefine what success looks like in your daily life, and genuinely regain control of your digital and mental bandwidth.
Because we really are constantly our own harshest critics.
But that's the thing. If this critical voice makes us feel terrible and directly leads to self-sabotaging behavior like binge-watching TV just to escape the pressure, why on earth does the brain keep it around?
Well, it seems entirely counterproductive, doesn't it? But the underlying mechanism is actually fascinating. The inner critic isn't really trying to destroy you, even though it feels that way.
It definitely feels that way.
Oh, absolutely. But it's a severely misguided defense mechanism. Evolutionarily, humans survived by staying in the tribe. Rejection literally meant death.
Wow, okay.
So your inner critic is desperately trying to protect you from past hurts, embarrassments, and the threat of social rejection. It operates on this really twisted logic. It thinks that by criticizing you first and punishing you internally, it can save you from the real-world pain of someone else doing it.
Oh, wow. When you put it that way, using those harsh words against ourselves is almost like friendly fire.
That is exactly what it is.
Having empathy for the exact voice that is calling you a failure. I mean, that is a massive paradigm shift, but logically, it makes complete sense. If you go to war with that critic and try to violently suppress it, you are just creating more internal conflict and stress.
Right, you were literally fighting yourself.
So, practically speaking, how do we actually disarm this defense mechanism without fighting it?
You counteract it with 3 specific actionable tools: wisdom, strength, and love. Let's look at the mechanics of each. So, wisdom in this context is essentially mindfulness.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
It's the psychological ability to step back and observe that negative thought like, I always mess things up, without attaching a judgment to yourself for having the thought in the first place.
Right.
You are just watching the thought happen as an event in your mind, not a permanent truth about your character.
So if I am afraid of a public speaking gig, wisdom is just noticing my brain telling me I'm going to bomb and saying, okay, well, that is a thought I am having, rather than panicking about the thought itself.
Precisely that. You strip the thought of its emotional weight, then strength comes into play. Strength is the active counterbalance where you deliberately pull up memories of your past successes to rebuild your self-esteem in real time.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, when the critic says you can't do something, you actively present the neurological evidence that you have done hard things before. You are engaging the logical part of your brain to override the emotional fear response.
You are basically bringing receipts to the argument with your own brain.
Exactly. And then the final piece is love, which sounds a bit abstract, but it really just means treating yourself with the exact same compassion you would instinctively offer a good friend.
Right.
I mean, if your best friend made a huge mistake at work, you wouldn't look them in the eye and say, "You are utterly useless, you are a fraud, and nobody likes you."
No, it would be sociopathic to say those things to a friend.
Right. You would tell them everyone makes mistakes, they're highly capable, and they're going to figure it out. Yet we say those horrific things to ourselves constantly. We directly attack our own core character.
Coach.
So, the practical exercise to start deploying wisdom, strength, and love is to catch the moment it happens. Identify your specific trigger, maybe as a terse email from your boss or a sudden memory of a past failure. Hit pause, take a breath, and ask yourself the hard questions. What am I truly afraid of right now? And what else am I feeling beneath this sudden flash of anger or shame?
Let's slow down on that last part, actually, because that is a huge realization for a lot of people. The idea that anger or shame is usually just a defensive cover for feeling incredibly vulnerable or exposed.
Absolutely.
We get mad at ourselves or our situation to avoid feeling sad or scared.
Because it is much easier for the ego to feel anger than to admit fear. Anger feels powerful, right?
Oh.
Vulnerability feels weak. Once you peel back that layer and identify that underlying fear, like maybe you are terrified of looking incompetent to your peers, you can actually address the real issue instead of just avoiding the task entirely.
So, if the inner critic's ultimate goal is to protect us from failure and rejection, it makes perfect sense that its absolute favorite weapon is perfectionist.
Oh, cool.
Because if we are completely flawless, nobody can ever criticize us or hurt us. But setting those expectations feels like a rigged carnival game.
A rigged carnival game. I like that.
You know the ones I mean, where the basketball hoop is just slightly too small for the ball, or the milk bottles you are throwing baseballs at are actually made of lead.
Right.
No matter how hard you throw, they aren't going down. You are setting a standard for flawless performance that is mathematically and humanly impossible to achieve, which means you're basically paying a heavy emotional toll just to guarantee your own failure. And the guy running the booth is your own brain, mocking you for missing.
That is a brilliant way to visualize the trap. Expecting perfection creates a vicious, self-defeating physiological cycle. When you inevitably fall short because, as you said, the game is completely rigged, that inner critic attacks mercilessly.
It hurts.
It really does. Suddenly, the stakes in your mind feel overwhelmingly high for every little task. Writing a simple email feels like a life or death scenario. And over time, that relentless pressure doesn't just make you tired. It spikes your cortisol levels constantly, which eventually manifests as clinical anxiety, deep depression, and total burnout.
And it completely paralyzes you. You can't even start cleaning that messy room or typing that document because the fear of the final result not being absolutely flawless is just too intense. So you avoid it.
Yes, exactly.
But the antidote here isn't just throwing your hands up, giving up, and settling for mediocrity. It is a concept called excellentism.
Excellentism is the sustainable, healthy alternative to perfectionism. It means you still set very high, ambitious standards for yourself, but you actually acknowledge the economic law of diminishing returns in your personal life.
Meaning you know when to stop.
Right. It is the deep understanding that hard work is absolutely essential, but at a certain point, spending another 5 hours tweaking the font and margins on a presentation is not making it functionally better. It is just feeding your anxiety. Quality matters just as much as quantity, and sometimes, well, done is better than perfect.
Done is definitely better than perfect. It is the profound realization that excellence is a journey, not a destination. Acknowledging your progress over your perfection is genuinely the only sustainable way to grow.
And because if you embrace excellentism, you can actually learn from your inevitable mistakes instead of letting every single misstep destroy your foundational self-worth.
It's so true.
But to really grasp how transformative that is, we have to look deeper into why we fall into that perfectionist trap in the first place. Like, why do we grip so tightly to these impossible standards of who we are supposed to be? And psychologically, it almost always boils down to unhealthy attachments.
By attachments, you mean taking our core identity and anchoring it to things entirely outside of our control.
Yes. When you attach your fundamental identity to material possessions, a job title, your relationship status, or even rigid ideological beliefs, you end up living in a constant low-level state of terror of losing them. Because if you lose them, you literally lose yourself.
Oh, wow.
Take material attachment. If your entire sense of self is tied to living a certain lavish lifestyle or driving a specific luxury car, you will make terrible, destructive financial decisions just to maintain that outward image. You will work yourself into the ground, burning out completely for possessions you never even have the free time to enjoy.
And attaching your identity to your beliefs has to be just as dangerous. I mean, who you are is completely tied to a specific political ideology or worldview, you effectively trap yourself in an intellectual echo chamber.
It creates a state of extreme intellectual fragility. It triggers intense perfectionism and how you demand the world should operate. You absolutely refuse to consider alternative perspectives. And the second your beliefs are challenged by new information, you don't just feel disagreed with, you feel personally attacked.
Because your brain thinks you're dying.
Exactly. It triggers intense defensive anger because your brain processes a challenge to your belief as a literal threat to your physical survival.
I understand the danger of attaching your identity to a car, a job title, or a political belief.
Yeah.
But I want to push back on this a little bit regarding people.
Okay, sure.
If we are supposed to practice non-attachment with the relationships in our lives, doesn't that just make you incredibly cold? I mean, honestly, that sounds almost impossible. If I am totally open with my partner but completely unattached to whether they stay or go, doesn't that just mean I don't really care about them? Aren't you just distancing yourself and avoiding true intimacy?
I am so glad you challenged that because it is the most common and damaging misconception about non-attachment. Relational non-attachment absolutely does not mean avoiding love or becoming some emotionless robot.
Yeah,
It is the crucial difference between care and control.
care and control.
Right. True non-attachment actually means being completely present and vulnerable with someone without suffocating them by clinging to them or trying to control a specific outcome to manage your own anxiety.
So it is loving someone entirely for who they are right in this exact moment, rather than who you expect them to be tomorrow to make you feel secure.
That is exactly the distinction. When you are anxiously attached, you view the other person as a life raft. If they pull away even slightly, you panic because you feel like you are going to drown. Non-attachment means you accept the natural impermanence of life. You allow the relationship to breathe and evolve naturally without the crushing weight of unrealistic expectations. You can love deeply without needing to possess.
That is beautiful, but it leads to the obvious challenge. How do we actually train our brains to do that? Because stepping back from that clinging and detaching from that rigid identity requires fighting against decades of deeply ingrained habits.
This is where a clinical framework like ACT acceptance and commitment therapy becomes incredibly valuable. ACT provides a brilliant mechanism for this by highlighting the psychological difference between seeing the self as content versus the self as context.
Wait, self as context? I'm not sure I follow that entirely. If I am not the content of my own thoughts, then what exactly am I in this scenario?
Let's use a spatial metaphor to explain how this cognitive fusion works. Imagine you are sitting in a movie theater watching a terrifying thriller.
Yeah.
You are so sucked into the story that you are gripping the armrests, your heart rate is 120 beats per minute, and your palms are sweating.
Been there.
In that moment, you have completely fused with the content on the screen. Your body is reacting as if the threat is real. That is viewing the self as content. You entirely believe the rigid, negative stories your mind plays for you. You think, I am an anxious person, or I am a total failure. You become the story playing on the screen.
You're basically living inside the projection. So what happens when we shift to self as context?
Self as context is the moment you force yourself to look away from the movie screen. Notice the exit signs glowing in the dark. Feel the fabric of the chair you are sitting in. And remember that you are just a person sitting in a quiet, safe movie theater.
Oh, that's such a great visual.
You are observing yourself with flexibility. You realize your identity is not fixed to the narrative. You are the context, the vast environment in which those passing thoughts happen. You are the observer of the thoughts, not the thoughts themselves.
I love that. It completely strips the threat level down. And that psychological shift translates directly into a super practical micro habit. When we catch our inner critic screaming an absolute catastrophic statement like, I am completely useless, or I always mess up my relationships, we can use a technique called sometimes thinking.
It is a profound neurological hack. You just mentally add the word sometimes to the end of your absolute thoughts.
So instead of I always mess up, it simply becomes I mess up sometimes. On the surface, it is such a minor linguistic shift, but the impact is huge. Why does adding that one word change how we feel so drastically?
It comes down to how your brain processes threats. When you tell yourself, I am a failure, your brain registers it as a permanent identity state. That absolute statement triggers a fight or flight threat response in your amygdala, the emotional center of your brain. You are literally panicking over your own self-worth.
Wow.
But when you add the word sometimes, you introduce a variable. It breaks the absolute rigidity of the story. That tiny introduction of nuance forces your brain to shift the processing out of the panicked amygdala and into the logical reasoning center, the prefrontal cortex. It introduces cognitive flexibility.
You're physically moving the thought to a calmer part of your brain.
Okay.
That's incredible. And we desperately need those practical, flexible tools right now, especially when we look at how this avoidance cycle manifests in our modern routines. Because we talked earlier about how our brains try to escape the discomfort of the inner critic. For most of human history, avoiding discomfort just meant like daydreaming or staring at a fire.
Right.
But for the modern listener, that escape hatch is right in our pockets 24 hours a day. The smartphone.
It is the ultimate avoidance machine. When the discomfort of a difficult task or a harsh internal thought hits, the phone immediately comes out. It is an involuntary reflex for most of us at this point. We swipe and scroll to flood our brains with cheap dopamine to drown out the cortisol spike from our inner critic.
But it is a trap, isn't it? Because the constant consumption of negative news or scrolling through heavily curated, mathematically optimized social feeds is directly damaging to our mental health. It doesn't soothe the inner critic, it arms it.
Exactly. It fuels that harsh internal voice with endless high-definition material for comparison and fear. You are feeding the beast while trying to hide from it.
So how do we break out of that?
To break this specific loop, you have to genuinely introspect and ask yourself a hard question. Why are you reaching for your phone in that specific microscopic moment? Are you looking to genuinely connect with someone you care about, or are you just trying to fill an uncomfortable void and distract yourself from a difficult emotion you don't want to process?
Because if you are using it to actively connect, build a relationship, or learn something valuable, that is a positive use of the tool.
Yeah.
But so often it is just a desperate fear of missing out or trying to numb that underlying anxiety and shame we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
To take back control of your digital life, you have to actively shift off autopilot. And that requires clear, grounded micro habits. First, practice the purposeful pause. Before you reach for your device, force a 2-second delay. Acknowledge your emotional state in that split second. Just ask yourself, am I reaching for this simply because I'm stressed about a deadline?
That 2-second pause is the moment you step out of the movie theater and remember you are in the audience. That is where you get your power back.
Precisely. Second, actively track how often you are pulling out your phone to avoid discomfort. You can't fix a habit you haven't quantified. And third, take immediate control of your environment by unfollowing negative accounts. Curate your digital feed so it is not a constant, overwhelming source of anxiety and unrealistic comparisons. Seek out accounts that share resources for managing your mentality, or that simply make you laugh without putting others down.
You have to ruthlessly protect your mental real estate. And importantly, we have to remind everyone listening that progress in this area is not a straight line. If you slip up tonight and find yourself doom scrolling for an hour when you meant to be reading, the absolute worst thing you can do is let the inner critic beat you up for it.
Yes, please do not do that.
Because if you shame yourself for failing, you just restart the exact avoidance cycle we are trying to escape. If you fall off the wagon, just jump right back on without the heavy judgment.
That right there is the perfect real-world application of excellentism. You strive for continuous improvement, but you embrace the inevitable mistakes as a necessary part of the journey. You don't demand perfection from your own healing process.
So bringing all of these massive concepts together into one clean takeaway for you today. Letting go isn't about ignoring your responsibilities or becoming an emotionless shell. It is about disarming that harsh, terrified inner critic with genuine empathy. It is abandoning the mathematically rigged carnival game of perfectionism and choosing the balanced, healthy pursuit of excellentism instead.
Absolutely.
And crucially, it is detaching your core, foundational worth from external outcomes, job titles, and things you simply cannot control.
Ultimately, the art of letting go is about giving yourself the grace, the space, and the permission to just be a flawed, growing human being without the constant burden of heavy internal judgment.
Let's take that a step further. Considering that absolutely no one on this planet is perfect, what unexpected and entirely delightful outcomes might happen in your life today if you finally allowed yourself to be imperfect and just saw what happened? Think about how much energy you would get back. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and remember to like and subscribe to get notified about the next episode.